If you're not with the people, of the people, for the people, what you're really probably hearing most are people that are telling you what they think you need or want to hear.
Welcome to Stickology. My guest today is Jeff Hunt, a true veteran in the communications and branding world. As founder of Legend Labs, Jeff has spent over 25 years helping some of the world's biggest brands from IBM to Nike navigate and overcome complex challenges. Jeff specializes in everything from crisis management and reputation to CEO communications. He joins us today to share some amazing insights. Jeff, I'm really excited to have you here today.
So good to be here, Steve. Really fond memories of our time working together in New York, and so proud of all that you've accomplished since then. So congratulations.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Let's dig in. Legend Labs has helped organizations create and live and protect their legends. I believe that legends lived with employees and customers alike. So I'm curious, how does a company's internal culture directly influence its public reputation?
Well, as you're sort of like the embodiment of everybody that represents you in every moment of every day. And we've always talked about, for example, in crisis situations, that oftentimes the first and most overlooked audience is your own people, who end up being the ambassadors. And so the number of times that we've had to remind organizations, hey, make sure you're keeping your own people well informed, because if they don't have the walk around narrative, who would? Who could help you? And so I think, getting a really good, clear understanding among your people, with your people, is critical. And frankly, I think it's critical for them to help you develop it. Meaning, to me, the best cultures are those in which you, quote unquote, crowdsource them with your own people, where you're kind of regularly asking them, what does it mean to be a winning, kind of organization? What does it mean to have, that kind of place at work that you really enjoy coming into, you feel challenged. So I think keeping that organic exchange is critical.
Jeff, do you see doing that from the top to bottom? Do you recommend surveys in person? How's this most effectively done?
I've often found that skip levels can be really helpful. I mean, I think one of the things that happens when you do strictly top to bottom is senior leaders can kind of what they want to hear. And to me, some of the best CEOs that I've worked with have made a point of like skipping levels and kind of getting into the heart, diving into the heart of the organization. So, for example, in a corporate environment with let's say, a heavy industrial, like literally getting into the factory floor and spending time with the people that are sort of on the floor and really hearing from them, to me, is critical. So I think sometimes breaking down some of the traditional hierarchy and really kind of getting a touch of what the pulse of the organization is all about is critical. And so I think it can happen. I think it had bottom up. I think it had middle down. I think it happened top to middle. But the idea is a commitment to fluidity and to really kind of recognizing that we want to hear from everybody to kind of create the culture that you know everybody would benefit from.
Well, they say those who are on the front line are the ones who really have a unique perspective and understand the business probably at the heart, right? I'm curious, we were supposed to speak a few weeks ago, and unfortunately, you had to reschedule because of a client crisis. Over the years, you have supported several companies in the midst of crisis. Can you share a story about a time when a company's culture, that could be good or bad, was the single most important factor in how it navigated a crisis?
We did a lot of work back in the day for the Pac-12 conference. Larry Scott was the commissioner. Um, and there were a lot of really interesting moments where the college athletics landscape was changing and changing rather dramatically. And there were a lot of moments where, Larry had to make some very tough calls. And what I really admired about his leadership is that he always leaned straight into his core values. Another one that really impressed me, I do a lot of work for the PGA Tour, and the commissioner of the tour has had, as you know, quite a few. This is Jay Monahan, quite a few crises that he's had to encounter with Live and other things that have transpired. And I remember taking him through a crisis simulation and really just being remarkably impressed with the way he and his team came through the simulation. And when we were doing the debrief, one of the things he said was that he was nervous in anticipation of the simulation. But once the simulation got running, he was just so confident because all they had to do is go back to their North Star core values. And every decision almost made itself if they just leaned into that sort of North Star core value. And I think that's so true with most of the companies I work with. And if you don't have that North Star core value, then you're sort of rudderless. You're kind of grasping for the moment. You're trying to do what you think is right now, as opposed to, hey, well, we know what the difference between right and wrong is. We know we're going to take great care of our people. We know we're going to always put the customer first. And so, whatever that means, and particularly, when there's litigation, kind of hanging in the backdrop, that's when courage and conviction to core values, to me, really steps up.
I agree with everything you're saying. Do you think it's reasonable to expect that that North Star can be uttered by everyone in the organization, or do you feel like that's a tall ask?
No, I think it's absolutely critical. I have these five principles that I sort of use in crisis and issue situations. One is, authenticity. People don't want to hear from institutions; they want to hear from real people. And that means that if I go six levels into your organization, I'm going to be hearing kind of the same sort of, culturally based, sentiments. Um, the second is this notion of transparency. Everything's discoverable in time. And so you have to assume that, it's going to come out. So you might as well sort of put it out on your terms. And I always say that if I'm in a boardroom and we're in a crisis situation and we're arguing over disclosure, in other words, do we have to, should we, we're toast. It's no longer a question of if we will disclose, it's more when and how we will disclose, right? And then, the third is, speed and agility and creativity. But those first two to me are all about culture. And so your people, your leadership, they cannot have any doubt in their minds about the type of organization that we are. And the look back on any crisis needs to really be strong that we did the right thing in the moment. As you know, the common question is, what did you know? When did you know it? What did you do based on when you know it? And there's a look back always to those moments right when the crisis occurs. And that's when a lot of missteps can happen. And to me, getting cultural alignment and operating in a way where your people are proud of the way you're comporting yourself in the moment, to me is the only marker of success.
There are a number of really good points you're making. It's interesting to think about DEI and how fragile it is, because in many ways it was constructed on the surface as opposed to with deep intent. I think there's a lot to be said for organizations taking into account different cultures and geography and racial backgrounds and gender and whatever, though. You need to listen.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
And I think, if you have to think about it, you probably haven't thought about it. And what I mean by that is it needs to be instinctive and natural. I think that, we still see that the biggest mistake a lot of organizations make is not prioritizing their own people first. They get so busy thinking about investors and the board and customers, and all, by the way, have to be thought about and have to be planned for. But to me, putting your people first and really understanding what they need, what they would want to be able to be the best ambassadors, for the company. Not that you're saying, hey, go out and speak publicly, because most of the time we want to contain who the spokespersons are. But look, they're going to be asked by their family members, friends, hey, what's going on at company X, Y, and Z? Their ability to, without any hesitation, saying, this happened, but we're doing the right thing, to me is critical.
And you want to hear what your internal ambassadors have to say too, right? I mean, the reality is there's a lot of negative stuff to be said about an echo chamber, but you want in your organization everyone to be speaking the same way. You want everyone to have their heads around the same vision, the same shared purpose. How have you worked with CEOs and leaders to effectively communicate new visions and foster a sense of purpose, a shared sense, well, especially in big and complex organizations?
Yeah. One of the things that we often get called in on is when there's a transition. So when you get a new CEO kind of coming in, or when there's a process being run by a company where there's a bench of potential talent and they're going to select the board, and the current CEO is going to select who the next CEO is going to be. And having a little bit of awareness, self-awareness, if you're that new CEO, that newly minted CEO, about how you want to be seen as a leader, and how you want to be perceived by all of your key constituents. And so we literally, get into this notion of the CEO brand, and it's not a vanity project, right? It's really more putting them to the test of saying, what do you want people to think about you? I'm talking about your own people, your customers. What do you want them to think, believe, see, and do? And really kind of getting that articulated at the outset to say this is the sort of the North Star for that CEO, right? This is what the values are that he or she, really holds dear. Uh, so that hitting the pause button early and getting a definition of the personal, way in which the CEO wants to comport herself, himself, is, I think, critical. So we do that. And then we also go ahead and start to kind of create a, sort of more of a plan, transactional plan. So how will the new CEO, how is he or she going to get engaged? What are they going to do to listen? What's going to be different? What's going to be unique? And all that can be thought of pretty early on. So I've had a few recent CEO transitions where, the CEO that's coming in after the preceding CEO uh, is hearing strongly that the employees feel like the current CEO is aloof, disconnected, and the CEO coming in wants to be connected. And right, so what are you going to do? So for example, I worked with a big multinational corporate where literally the CEO made the announcement of his selection on the factory floor. So rather than being in the corporate headquarters, the press release goes out. He does a video, on the floor, the manufacturing floor with the workers saying how thrilled he is to be, at the heartbeat of this company. And it just immediately sends a signal of a new day dawning, right? This is not going to be your father's Oldsmobile.
That sense of authenticity, that sense of connection is really important. I would argue it's easier to do in easy times than in hard times. And I'm curious, how do you coach leaders to keep that authenticity, keep themselves grounded, keep themselves connected when they're under such pressure?
I think you have to be truthful. I mean, trust is sort of everything. And how many times have you and I, frankly, helped construct memos that are such, I mean, I don't know if I'm allowed to say like bullshit,
You can say whatever you want.
bullshit, right? Right. You sort of read it like, and it's almost like the old Saturday Night Live skits where you have, Mr. Subliminal and you've got what he really means kind of captioned at the bottom. And we can all read it. He or she is leaving to pursue other interests, instead of we fired her because she violated our principles and didn't, really kind of stand up for. And I'm not saying you can always be completely transparent. There's lots of HR reasons why you can't, but more so than not, the opportunity to just be honest and truthful. So look, the business is coming on hard times. We're losing revenue. It's painful, but we've got to make cuts. And we're going to do the best job we can to, make this fair, judicious. I think people at the end of the day respect that as opposed to, what I call that sort of that bullshit bingo. I mean, I remember sitting around early in my career where you'd be like in a conference room or on a conference call, and you'd be like hearing certain words, right? And it's like bullshit, and you put it on the bingo to see who gets bingo first. So I think just being truthful, being honest, being transparent, being forthright is critical. Now you can't do that if you lose connectivity to the heart of the organization. If you literally are sitting kind of in the tower, I don't care if you're a college president or a CEO of a company, if you're not with the people, of the people, for the people, what you're really probably hearing most are people that are telling you what they think you need or want to hear. So I think that there's no trade-off for actually getting your hands in the midst of it. I mean, in other words, getting into it with with folks and people. So if that means riding around on the Coca-Cola delivery truck so that when the person's, going in to make the call, you're right there with them learning. I think smart executives, are really kind of planning ways in which they can stay connected uh, to the through line of the organization.
And you've done just that in your career. You've managed teams. You lived in the US, you lived in Latin America, Europe, Asia, in all places running big teams. I'm curious what you've learned about building a cohesive culture where people are from all different cultures, all different countries. What have you learned, and what would you embark based on those learnings to leaders based off of this global economy that we live in?
I mean, it really to me speaks to the power and the necessity of diversity. Um, Unfortunately, diversity, equity, inclusion to me got politically hijacked. Um, but the fact of the matter is, diversity and inclusion, and the word inclusion is an interesting word because you can sit and have a table of diversity, but if you don't listen to them, in other words, you just have the diversity so you can tick a box and say, look how diverse our board is, or look how diverse our, that's pointless to me. You need diversity because odds are, no matter what type of organization you are, you're probably serving diverse customers, diverse clients. That's why you need diversity. So, I look back at the last, 2 years, and a lot of these DEI initiatives that have been unwound have been easy to unwind because they were put into place, on false pretenses. In other words, they weren't really core, organic, value-based moves. They were like, frankly, a reaction to a very tragic situation that happened largely with George Floyd. Everybody felt the need to do something. And so everybody made these quick moves to like show, look at us, we believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they weren't most of them were not grounded in true core values of why we need and why we want and why we respect diversity. And that's why so many of them, by the way, even before Trump, I mean, I know people say, well, that's because of Donald Trump. Diversity, equity, inclusion, started coming unwound before Trump. Probably after the Supreme Court decision in the Harvard case. But it just showed to me the lack of substance. So I think if you're a company, an organization, you have to really respect culture and diversity. And you also, if you're a global company, you really have to understand that, all the best ideas are not necessarily invented here. And you have to be willing to kind of listen and understand, hey, some of our best creative ideas are coming from Brazil. You know, some of our best, gains in efficiency are coming from Japan. And so to me, the enlightened CEO that can kind of look at his organization or her organization and say, I'm going to sort of like go where I get the best of the best. That to me that's critical.
There are a number of really good points you're making. It's interesting to think about DEI and how fragile it is, because in many ways it was constructed on the surface as opposed to with deep intent. I think there's a lot to be said for organizations taking into account different cultures and geography and racial backgrounds and gender and whatever, though.
We've got a diverse group of people who bring diverse perspectives, and we listen, right? We listen to them because that's core to who we are. That's core to our values. And there are some organizations out there, by the way, that have stayed true to that. I mean, I think, for example, they're not a client, but I think Microsoft. Microsoft has had that, at its core well before DEI became a thing, and they still have it. And they're not eliminating it. If anything, they're doubling down on it because they recognize that they're a global company and they need a lot of talent, a lot of diverse talent.
The best form of communications for any leader is listening. And maybe that's why we're given 2 ears and one mouth. I don't know. Reputation is super fragile. Can you recall a moment, a single action from a leader, good or bad, that unexpectedly shifted public perception? And also, what did that company learn from that? And how did it change their course going forward?
I mean, I'll tell you one that's going on and it's been going on and will continue to go on is Fukushima. And the nuclear disaster that happened at Fukushima, terrible tragedy. I did work with them for about 4 years. It was bad. They owned it. They've owned and continue to own the cleanup. They've got like frankly, a 50-year commitment to it. Doesn't mean that their reputation is like completely clean, right? But if you go back and look at where they were, a year after the accident, 2 years after the accident, I think they demonstrated this sort of like doggedness to like make it right. And so gradually, people were able to move closer and closer and closer to the original towns surrounding the facility. It's cleaner, it's greener. Uh, just almost the opposite of what you found with Chernobyl, right? Where they just tried to put like a dome over it and like pretend it didn't happen. So I think the Japanese owned up to it, and I think that they're on a long journey. They're not looking at it quarter to quarter. They're spending a ton of money, but they're doing the right thing. That's one that I personally did work on, and I think that they've really carried themselves well. Um, I think there are others, that are out there. I think, frankly, even though it doesn't get a lot of attention, I think the moves that Exxon made after Valdez, you know, proved to be responsible. You could argue that they had to come kicking and screaming, but I think they did the right thing ultimately. Even BP, you know, and again, it all comes down to transparency. Because as soon as these organizations are willing to, and by the way, that was the toughest part about Japan because it's a very closed society. So getting them to open up and really share what they were doing was really tough. But once they did, and not just in Japan, but globally, because that's where the big problem was. They were basically threatening the whole nuclear industry worldwide. So those are a couple, that come to my mind.
Those are great examples. And it's a really good reminder that any organization that experiences trouble is not only impacting their own reputation, they're impacting the entire industry's reputation at times. I want to go back to employees. I'm curious, what are the things that you've done over time and recommended that others do to make those frontline workers feel a genuine sense of belonging, a genuine sense of support from the organization as a whole?
Yeah, I think you have to build in systems. Um, and the problem with building in systems is it's easy to build in systems that lose a touch and a feel, right? In other words, you put the suggestion box in, you think problem solved, right? So these systems, or I would call it more of a systematic approach to staying in touch, need to stay authentic, and they need to feel like really that you really do want to hear. I mean, I've been saying for a long time that we're an over-surveyed nation. I mean, you can't even go into the bathroom these days without coming out and having to take a survey. Did you like it or didn't you like it? And pretty quickly, that all becomes wallpaper, right? And so we're now living in this world of net promoter. We're starting to move more toward engagement. And at some point, these surveys, employee surveys, customer surveys, they all just become like, frankly, noise. So to me, you have to have, an efficient yet very authentic way, of truly staying connected. So I believe that we're now kind of in this era of engagement, and engagement needs to be defined as the mutual exchange of value. So if you take it in the customer world, we start off with customer satisfaction. We measure it 1 to 5 scale. 3.5 was the threshold. Harvard did all the research. If you had 2, it was no better than 1 or 3.2. Then we went from there to loyalty. Loyalty was the key thing. Satisfied customers great, but a loyal customer is better. You had to hit 4 on that scale of 1 to 5. Then we moved from there to net promoter, and we're still somewhat in net promoter, but the idea is satisfied's good, loyal's better, net promoter even better. Well, now because of what I believe the advantages of digital, social, AI, we have this now new era of engagement, which again I define as the mutual exchange of value. So not only will you be satisfied, not only will you be loyal, not only will you promote my company, you'll actually help me create the products or services or the work environment that I want. That I want if I listen. And you'll remember back in our early days, because you were involved, that those first crowdsourcing platforms, right, where Dell came out and said, help us design the laptop of the future. And lo and behold, we get backlit keyboards. Big deal, right? But if you listen, they'll tell you, they'll come. And so I think that's the way these organizations now need to be thinking about it is how do we really affect true engagement where there's a mutual exchange of value? So I listen to you, you listen to me, you help me create the workplace that people thrive in. That does great things for our products, our sales, our services. That drives great customers. Great customers drive great revenue. Great revenue drives great investor. So it all kind of works together.
If there's anything we've learned from social media, we've learned that communications is a two-way street, right? And that everyone has a voice. And with that in mind, I'm curious, what's your best advice for a company trying to build a brand that its employees and customers will stick with for life? And how do you use media to navigate that successfully?
Well, I mean, as you know, again, you and I did a lot of work together on this, but the first thing you have to do is you have to define differentiation. So, what makes your organization, your company, your brand truly different and unique in a sea of sameness? And then the second thing you have to define is relevance. Why should people care? What are we doing to build an environment, for example, that people really want to come to work in and thrive on? And you need to put a lot of thought into that differentiation and relevance. Once you get that figured out, you can then move toward, awareness or knowledge, right? And then ultimately you earn esteem. Well, what happens all too often is organizations start with awareness and they haven't really defined differentiation and relevance. And so they can waste a lot of time, money, and energy spending it, going out and communicating, but with no clear sense of purpose. And I think that applies internally, and I think that applies externally.
So, Jeff, I have one final question for you. What is the most important lesson that you would try to instill upon a rising executive about the relationship between a company's leadership, its culture, and its ultimate success?
I think, to me, listening with intent, you know, fake listening, it's not the same. And people know it, by the way. People know when you're really, truly asking them to give you what they think and feel versus you're just kind of going through the motions. So I think listening with intent. The other thing that I'm a really big believer in is imagining the world that you want to live. One of my favorite quotes of all time is the Thoreau quote. It says, if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to lead the life which he has imagined, he will meet with success unexpected in common time. And what that quote says to me is you're really unlimited by your ability to sort of dream the biggest dreams. One of my favorite books is The Alchemist. And as it's kind of the name of our company, but it seems to me that once you've imagined what you want, all roads kind of rise up to meet you. And you can hear it defined and described in different ways. Oh, divine intervention. But really what it is that once you've had the mindfulness of imagining what you want, you see things that you otherwise wouldn't see. And so to me, that's a critical thing for executives. And by the way, it was one of the things that I always really appreciated about you from our earliest days. You were in this kind of like operating role, but I'll never forget the work we did together on the Dell pitch. And frankly, we're sitting, in Austin with a bunch of on our desk pitching, then one of the largest computer companies. And you and I and a small team of people had the gumption to imagine that we could be their global partner. And we basically threw caution to the wind. We developed a very, very creative, if you remember that proposal, how creative that was, thanks to you. And, we won the business, right? Because we had the ability to kind of imagine what life would be like if we won the business. So that to me is, the key thing is really be open-minded, have big dreams, and don't be afraid, to go after them once you've got them in your mind. And then other people will come and help you. They really will. People generally like to help other people. So you got to make your dreams known.
You're giving me goosebumps, Jeff. I appreciate it. I've learned a lot from great people, and you are definitely one of them. I appreciated you then, and I appreciate you today. I really enjoyed today's conversation with Jeff Hunt. He shared his philosophy on how a company's internal culture dictates its external reputation. Jeff also provided 3 essential high impact strategies for leaders. Number 1, define and live the North Star. Clearly articulate your core values so they become an instinctive North Star for every employee. In a crisis, these values should make the decision automatic, ensuring that a company always does the right thing. Number 2, listen to the front line. Get out of the tower and proactively engage your people using methods like skip level meetings or visiting the factory floor. This constant connection ensures that you are authentic and can build trust necessary to weather tough times. And number 3, drive mutual engagement. Move past surveys and listen to your employees. Allow them to co create the best possible work environment and products in the world. Jeff has me thinking about my approach for sure. I hope this conversation was as impactful for you, the listener, as it was for me.